Thank you, Mr President, and I'll just start with an apology to you. I'm sorry to keep you around here for 20 minutes, but I did think you enjoyed my speech so much the other night that I'll actually double it tonight. I know the hard-working girls, the Whip's office, Charlotte and Beck, really enjoyed it, so I'm going to do 20 minutes tonight. But I did want to contribute to the debate earlier this evening on government expenditure. I thought that was an excellent debate, a very worthwhile motion moved by Senators Day and Leyonhjelm, an incredibly important issue that at times doesn't get the airing it deserves in this place, I think. Unfortunately, sometimes in question time we seem to focus on what people said yesterday and what they did or didn't apologise for today, not on the big issues that actually affect this country, and there's not many bigger than the debt we have right now and how we're going to pay it back. We've got about $340 billion in debt right now as a nation, and that's only growing. It's going to grow faster as our population ages, and I just want to talk a little bit about why that's such a risk and why we need to act now to fix it. While I was listening to the debate from other people, I remember a quote from a great public choice economist, James Buchanan. He was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, basically invented a new field of economics and public choice theory. And he once said that socialism may be dead, but Leviathan lives on. And he was exactly right, that while the theories of Marx and his successors certainly have lost credit in the last 20 years, those of Keynes and others have not. Those of Hobbes, who that quote Leviathan, his book, comes from, and I mentioned Hobbes in my maiden speech. I think he said many useful things, and it is true that we as a parliament, as a government, do have a contract with the people of Australia, do have a contract with the people that are governed by this place, to make sure we provide the right things, make sure we provide the protection to the weak, make sure we help those who can't help themselves, and of course, most of all, make sure we defend our nation from external threats. But that Hobbes probably didn't anticipate Keynes, and since Keynes came along, we have had an obsession with spending and a minimisation of the risks of too much government spending and too much debt. And we're all Western countries, and we're probably at the back of the pack on this, unfortunately, but all Western countries have borrowed too much, spent too much, way above their budgets in the last 20 or 30 years. And mainly they've done that either in response to economic recessions or threats, with an overconfident approach to or reach to Keynesian policies, or they've done it in a desperate attempt to buy votes, and that has often led to dire outcomes, and where we're at right now. And that great economist James Buchanan, he also said that the response to too much debt, the response to having too much government spending, is like someone dieting, is like someone with an obesity problem. They're always trying to get onto a better diet. They're always trying to say, today I'm not going to eat less, or tomorrow I'm going to do this, or next week I'm going to exercise more. And the same thing happens with governments. They make promises to say that tomorrow I will be better, tomorrow I'll stop spending, and we saw that in the last 6 years. We saw in the last 6 years a government that continually said we're going to produce a budget surplus, not today, but sometime soon. We won't produce it in this budget that we're delivering today, but we're going to produce it 3 years' time. We're going to produce it in 3 years' time, 3 years early. The problem is that never happened. It never happened. And the Labor Party clearly had, in a spending sense, an obesity problem. And I think they really, in opposition now, need to look at the fact that, well, perhaps they need to go on something like The Biggest Loser. They need to go on a program like that so they get weighed, work out how much they're spending, how much debt they've got, and work out how they're going to fix that. What kind of regime are they going to go through to make sure they can cut spending and actually balance a budget? Actually balance a budget, because the Labor Party have not balanced a budget federally since 1989. I was 9 years old in 1989, and the Labor Party has not balanced a budget since then. But they continually oppose those savings that have been put up. They oppose some that they put up themselves when they said they were going to deliver a budget surplus. When they said they were going to deliver a budget surplus, they put forward savings, like on those for the R&D tax credit, legislation that is up in front of this place right now. But instead of supporting the savings they actually put up just about a year ago, just over a year ago, they've now changed their position and are opposing those savings. And that is just the absolute sign of someone who can't diet properly. I need to lose a few kilos myself, but before I needed a carb up before this speech, and I went down to the diner and I had healthy options to choose, but I went for the bucket of chips. Mr President, I sinned, and I do feel a lot better after those chips, but I won't look better next week, certainly. But that's the problem with the Labor Party. They always go for the buck of the chips. They don't take the proper regimen of having some salads, going for a run around the lake, and getting better, doing something that is tough right now, comes at some kind of cost, but it's going to pay off in the future. It's going to pay off for the generations that come beyond us. And I want to speak a little bit about what those problems are for our future generations. We do often hear about our budget situation today, where we're at, and last year we had a $50 billion budget deficit. Everyone in Australia put $2,000 on their credit card thanks to the government last year. $50 billion is about just over $2,000 per person. So anyone listening right now, anyone in this chamber, it's $2,000. We've got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 senators in, 6, sorry, Mr. President, 6 senators here at the moment. So each of us borrowed $2,000 thanks to the Australian taxpayer and put that on the nation's credit card. But it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse. I used to work for a place called the Productivity Commission, and about 10 years ago they did a report on the ageing population. It was in 2004, I think. At the time, if we didn't change anything, if we just kept going the way we were, and back then in 2004 we had big surpluses at the time, but if we didn't change any policies, the gap between our spending and our revenue as a government, as a nation in fact actually, not just as the Australian government but with state governments included, the gap between spending and revenue until 2050, so about 45 years, was going to be $2.2 trillion. And then if we borrowed to spend that money, to be able to spend that money, we'd end up with a debt over $4 trillion. Now, that's pretty scary, but last year the Productivity Commission reissued a new report, an update on that report if you like, and things have obviously got worse since then. And that's been a result of the mismanagement of our finances over those last 6 years. In this new report, from today, or from 2011 when the report was started, through to 2060, we're going to have a gap between our spending and revenue of $3.2 trillion, an extra $1 trillion to borrow. It's so much money it's hard to think of. And if we borrow, actually the Productivity Commission didn't do those calculations this time, but a former staffer from there is in my office, Colin Clark, he helped do the numbers for me, that if we do borrow at an interest rate of 4%, which is pretty conservative, if we did borrow that $3.2 trillion over that time, year on year, we'd end up with a debt at the end of that period of $7 trillion. $7 trillion. Now that would be more than 200% of our GDP. Sorry, a little bit under that, so it's about 150% of our GDP, I think, at that time. These are all in 2011 dollars, so it takes out inflation. We'd be in the category of Greece and Japan and other nations. Now that's a long way in the future. We've got decades to prepare for that, but we've got to know that when we make decisions now, because every decision we make today not to deal with that issue means it's something that someone has to do in the future to deal with that issue, because we'll ultimately end up in that place. That makes it so much more important why we need to try and get our budget into balance right now. And that hasn't happened in the last 6 years. As I say, these figures have blown out immeasurably in that time period. And the reason they've done that is because of the deficits we've run in the last 6 years. In a period where we've had strong economic growth, we've had strong growth in our terms of trade. If you believed in the lessons of Keynes, you'd think you'd be running surpluses through that period, because you should be saving during a strong economic growth period to have the funds for a rainy day when things turn around. But let's just go through it. The Labor Party had 6 budgets over that period. Their first budget was a $27 billion deficit. The second was a $54 billion deficit. That was a record, that one. That was the biggest in history. Still is. Record's going to be hard to break. The next one after that, the third one, was a negative $47 billion. The fourth was a negative $43 billion. They got to negative $18 billion, I think it was 12-13. That was the year that we were meant to have a surplus, but they shifted a lot of money around to try and get there. They were still $18 billion short. And last year, of course, as I said earlier, we had a $50 billion deficit. All up over those 6 years, we had deficits of $240 billion in just 6 years. Unbelievable. Unbelievable amount of spending from the Labor Party. But they did do it, and now we've got to clean it up. And the only way to clean it up is to look at the areas of your budget that spend the most money. Fixing the nation's budget shouldn't be overcomplicated. No different than fixing a household budget. You look at what your spending items are, you look at what you're spending too much money on, and you try and clamp down on them. And in our budget, the reality is what the federal government spends, what we spend, is taken up, a big part of it is taken up by two areas, by welfare and health. Welfare accounts for about 33%, a third of our budget, $140 billion a year we spend on welfare. And this government has tried to introduce some reforms to cut spending on welfare, as well as encouraging people to get jobs. But that's been blocked by this place. It's been blocked by the Senate. And that does two things that are of concern. First, it means we don't get the savings, of course, to our budget that we would otherwise want, and trying to cut back on that item of expenditure. And second, we don't receive the benefits in terms of productivity or increased workforce participation that those reforms would otherwise deliver. And that has been doubly disappointing, but that the Labor Party has blocked those. One of the next biggest areas of expenditure is health, and that's 15% of our nation's budget and growing rapidly. And again, the Labor Party does not want to do anything about trying to help slow the growth in health spending. Now, this side of government has taken, this side of the parliament has taken a very difficult decision to say we should increase. We should put a price signal on people going to the doctor. The Labor Party believes in putting a price signal on carbon. The Labor Party believes in putting a price signal on prescription drugs, but they don't believe in putting a price signal on going to the doctor. A very moderate price signal of just $7 a visit, capped at $70 for pensioners and those with healthcare cards a year. But they won't want to do that. They're not doing that because they see a political opportunity in opposing that, which is unfortunate because, as I said, we have an economic reason, an economic opportunity to help fix these problems. And a moderate cost on people going to the doctor is something that Bob Hawke proposed in the 1980s, that the Assistant Treasurer of the Labor Party had proposed in a book. I think I've got it in my office. I think it was called Imagining Australia. He proposed that in a book a few years ago. But he's walked away from it. And he's walked away from it because of politics, not because of economics. And I think that's unfortunate, because if we don't do things in either the welfare area or the health area, you can pretty much forget about dealing with those long-term budget and expenditure problems that I described earlier, those trillion-dollar problems. And if you want to fix a trillion-dollar problem, you've got to start with expenditure in the billions, and that's with areas like welfare and health. Now, the other way we can help deal with this problem, and Senator Sinodinos in the debate made very good points in this regard, and it's often overlooked. We do need to cut our expenditure. We do need to get those savings through the parliament and have a reasonable and forward-looking debate on them. But the other way we can help deal with this issue is to ensure that economic growth remains strong. And we've had a difficulty in the last decade in achieving high productivity growth, and ultimately it's productivity growth which will determine how much money we have in the future, how much we can afford on schools or hospitals or roads. So we need to become as productive as we can, and all that means is saying we need to be able to use the resources we've got in the most efficient way. We need to be able to make sure we can do more with less every year. And if we do that, we will maintain our high standard of living and our highly equitable access to hospitals and schools, which is a foundation stone of our nation. But in the last 10 years, our multi-factor productivity growth, which is a broad measure of productivity across capital and labour markets, that's been falling at 1.2% a year, been falling. There's lots of reasons for that, but it has been falling. Across the world, the average has been 0.6% in the last 10 years. So it hasn't been a global phenomenon. It's not like we're just riding along or going backwards along a wave created by other nations. We have been well behind other nations, and it's something that we have to look at and rectify. Our average productivity growth in the last 30 years has been about 0.7% a year, and if we could return to that average over the next 10 years, in just 10 years, if we could have achieved that productivity growth rate instead of what we have been, in just 10 years we'd have an extra $6,000 or so per Australian in our GDP. So average incomes would rise by about $6,000 a year. And when you think of the changes we make in this parliament, the price signal on Medicare, for example, is going to cost people $70 a year if you're a pensioner or a person with a healthcare card. This reform alone could add $6,000 a year if we were able to get that productivity growth. More importantly for this debate and expenditure, though, if we were able to get the productivity growth rate up, that automatically brings our spending down as a percentage of GDP, of course, because the pie becomes bigger, and what we take up, the resources we take up in this place, become a smaller part of that pie. And if we were able to do that in 10 years, our spending in GDP terms would drop from 26.5%, which is where it's at the moment, to 24.8% in 10 years. And that would go back to where it's been this long-term average in terms of government spending. And that assumes, that calculation that I did assumes we don't make any savings. We just stay with all our other spending. We keep it all in place. Just through that action, just through getting high productivity growth, we'd be able to get our spending as a share of GDP back to something more reasonable. And that is the power of compound growth, and that's why it's so important to make sure each year on year we're achieving as much productivity growth as we can. And as well as the government saving agenda, the government has established a strong agenda to try and achieve those productivity gains through a range of areas. I just want to highlight a few. Of course, first of all, the agenda, the deregulatory agenda, is very, very important. Labor tried to make attempts in the last 6 years to achieve that. I think they were frustrated in a number of areas. They were frustrated through COAG. Some of these things weren't their fault. I'm not trying to be political, but it is very, very difficult to get these things done. But this year, one of the most important reforms we have done is to set up the one-stop shop and improve the approvals for large projects, because it's been a disgrace, a national disgrace in this country, how long it takes to get large-scale investments approved. And that was something the Labor Party did want to tackle, that the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard announced they were going to tackle. Then they walked away from it. They walked away from it because the Greens didn't like it. Now, since we've set up those one-stop shop arrangements, the bilateral agreements with state governments, around $1 trillion of new projects has been approved. Things like, well, actually that wasn't approved in that last year, but I do want to highlight the bauxite mine south of Embley, which was approved under the former Labor government just before they stopped. But they took 975 days to approve it. It was initially approved very quickly, then the Wilderness Society wrote a letter to Tony Burke and he stopped the clock. And it took them 975 days to approve a $1.4, I think it is, billion project in Cape York, a disadvantaged part of our nation. It's an absolute disgrace that it takes that long. So if we deregulate more, we'll get those projects up, we'll get more jobs going, and that will help our productivity growth. There's broader reforms we've got to do, and these things we need to do more work on. Things like taxation through the White Paper, and Senator Day made a number of important contributions in that regard, and I agree with him. We need to look at indexing our tax threshold, because that is just a deterrent on people getting ahead. They know that through bracket creep the government's going to get you every time. If they don't get you this year, they're going to get you through inflation, and without even becoming wealthier, you're going to pay more tax and be in high tax brackets. But if we gave people the confidence that we, as a government, we would not just index people's welfare payments, but we would index their tax thresholds as well, that would give people more confidence to have a go and take some risks in their life. The other thing I think is very important is to make sure, while we do have spending constraints, we don't forget to invest in the areas of our nation which are going to deliver economic growth and deliver those productivity gains. And that is going to be at the frontiers of our nation. Where there's a basic theory in economics that, when your capital stock is low, your return on capital is going to be higher. That marginal return on capital for just another factory or another road in an area where there isn't much infrastructure right now will make a big difference. And places, Senator McGrath spoke earlier about a trip he and I did to the Gulf and across to Cairns. Enormous opportunities in that region. If we can get off our backsides and approve the projects, approve the more use of water, get some irrigation going, and that will create jobs. And again, we'll take the sun and water and soil that exists there now and start producing a product that people want to buy. And that's, by definition, going to increase our productivity. And finally tonight, I just wanted to focus on the most controversial and the hardest thing we need to do, which is industrial relations reform. Senator Dastyari spoke about the casualisation of the workforce, and he's absolutely right. That is a great concern. But it is also fundamentally true that after the former Howard government introduced reforms to industrial relations after they won the 2004 election, full-time employees surged. The number of people being employed in full-time work surged because of those reforms. And it's pretty simple, pretty simple. You make it easier to hire people, people are going to hire more of them. That's all it is. That's all it is. It's very fundamentally true. And not just that, unemployment fell. Unemployment fell, and unemployment fell before GDP rose. Usually it's the other way around. GDP usually kicks up, then unemployment starts to fall because businesses become busier and they get the confidence to hire more people. But after work choices came in, it worked the other way. Unemployment went down first, and then GDP kicked up. And unemployment fell so much that by the end of the Howard government, less than 4% of people were out of work in this nation. Today it's over 6%. That represents about 250,000 people. And if we can do one thing in this place which helps people,
and helps their life in a measurable way. It's to help them get a job. And I think it's a disgrace that 250,000 people are out of work now when they might not have to be if we had some decent industrial relations laws in this country.